Okay, so when you get into what Christians have called Holy Week, I think people think about these days probably in this order. You've got obviously Easter Sunday. That's the big day. Resurrection Sunday. Probably under that, you've got, I think there'd be a competition between Good Friday and Palm Sunday. So right there. Then some Christians would recognize Maundy Thursday. One thing that I think is probably incontrovertible is that Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Saturday of Holy Week are not something that people think about a lot during Holy Week. And it is now honestly, if someone you were to go up to the normal Christian and be like, what happened on Tuesday of Jesus's final week? Most Christians would say, I'm actually not quite sure. So help us out. Help us understand what was going on. So it's after Palm Sunday.
Yeah.
And there's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then there's in between Good Friday and Easter Sunday. What was happening? Give us the play-by-play of what's going on in Jesus's final week.
Sure. Yeah. I think what's helpful about knowing what's taking place during those days is that the events that transpired in those days is what led to the events of Good Friday and the crucifixion and all that. So the rising tensions and the controversies that ensued is what finally sparked the arrest, trial, and eventually sentencing and crucifixion of Jesus.
Okay.
So Sunday finishes the triumphal entry into Jerusalem with all the pilgrims that are all arriving for the Passover. So
it's like hundreds of thousands of people.
Yeah, Passover was one of the great pilgrimage festivals where everyone was required to travel to Jerusalem to celebrate the festival. So all these people that don't live in Jerusalem normally, and Jerusalem was the biggest city in Israel, but they were all gathering. So the city is overflowing with all kinds of religious fervor and celebration and seeing family and friends and all that. And Jesus does the triumphal entry, and he finishes, it says, by going to the temple. Now, he's only there for a little bit. He says he goes in there, walks around, and leaves. And he's staying at Bethany every night. So Bethany's about 2 miles outside of town. Likely he was staying with Lazarus and his sisters, Mary and Martha. Who
was raised from the dead.
That's right, same Lazarus, yeah. So they were his friends. They were 2 miles outside of town with his disciples.
Okay.
So that's where they're probably staying. But then every day they went to Jerusalem and they went home at night to Bethany and came back and forth. Okay. So Monday morning, right? He just had all the hoopla of this triumphal entry and people claiming Hosanna and wanting to see what is this Davidic Messiah going to do. And so he goes to the temple. On the way, he has this kind of parabolic action of cursing the fig tree, which the next day they see withered, and that's kind of a physical sign of the fig tree representing Israel and being withered because it's now desolate.
So it's like a picture for people to see that Israel's in trouble.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. So he goes to the temple, and he knows what he's going to find there because he just saw it the night before.
Right.
And so all these people are coming, and they have to offer sacrifices, and they have to offer this temple tax. And so they're traveling with all their family and belongings. So they don't have a lot of stuff, so they have to buy animals, and they have to exchange money in some cases in order to do the sacrifices. Okay. And all these money changers are there, and people who are selling these animals for sacrifice, and they're taking advantage of the people.
Okay.
So now this temple, which is supposed to be where they're worshiping God as an act of devotion to God, they're profiting off of that. So he goes in there, and it's the classic cleansing of the temple. And so
this is the whip and the
that's
table.
right.
Okay.
He's overturning the tables, and he's saying, "You're turning my father's house into this is supposed to be a house of prayer. You turn into a den of robbers." And and actually the people love it, right? Because they're getting taken advantage of. But the subtext in all of that is the religious authorities are kind of just watching this happen. And they're not happy. Because they're at least this is happening under their watch. So they're kind of condoning this, but they're likely also profiting from it. So Jesus is directly challenging them. And so that's what happens. And and so they're not happy about that. And then he leaves and goes back to Bethany that night.
So it's like he goes in on Monday, turns up the heat on these religious leaders, and he's growing in popularity.
Well, and the people love it.
Yeah.
That's right. And it's like, I mean, it's a big, obvious thing. So everyone's seeing this happen.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, this is the center of action in town. And like this guy, he doesn't live in Jerusalem. He shows up, but with all this kind of triumphal procession, and then
Okay.
kind of blows it up, blows up what has been happening,
Right.
the establishment.
So he goes home Monday.
Yep.
Sun comes up on Tuesday. What happens next?
So he heads back to the temple from Bethany with his disciples, and as soon as he gets there, right away, the religious authorities are ready for him. Like, hey, we're not going to let this guy just go unchallenged again. So right away, they challenge his authority.
Okay.
And they do this with a question. They're like, all right, they start. Who gave you the authority to do all this, to teach what you did, and to make these declarations? And he responds in his way that Jesus does with a question. Okay, well, let me ask you a question, and if you answer my question, I'll answer your question, right? And he says, was John's baptism from God or from man?
John
the Baptist.
John the Baptist. Okay.
And
that's who baptized Jesus.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. And of course, they don't like John the Baptist, but he was popular with the people. And so this illustrates this tension between the religious leaders and the crowds.
Okay.
That keeps coming up over and over again in these days. And they're like, well, they reason to themselves, well, shoot, if we say it's from God, he's going to say, well, why didn't you recognize him as a prophet? So they can't say that, but they can say he was just a man, because that'll make the people upset because they actually thought he was a prophet. So they're like, well, we don't know. And he's like, well, then I'm not going to answer your question either. So they don't like that. So it kind of silences them for a moment. And then he launches into 3 parables back to back to back.
Parables are
stories that are illustrating a spiritual truth.
Okay.
And he tells these stories, and each one of these parables are critiquing the religious leaders for not accepting the Messiah. And they know it. Yeah. They know exactly what he's doing.
Yeah.
The connections are obvious.
Okay.
So they're like, okay, the direct challenge didn't work when he showed up at the temple. So let me try another approach. So now they try a more subtle tactic to try to get Jesus to trip himself up in front of the people. So then after these 3 parables, there's 3 waves of people that come to question Jesus, to try to trap him. And the first is an unlikely alliance of the Pharisees, Jesus' religious opponents, and the Herodians, Jesus' political opponents, who don't like each other. But they team up together to come and ask Jesus about, hey, should we pay taxes to Caesar? And again, it's like, well, which way do you go? Please the people or please in this case, the civil authorities? And the Romans, they don't need any extra encouragement to squash an uprising. So any sort of civil unrest, and the hammer's coming down fast. And that's part of what led to Jesus being arrested and all that.
Yeah.
And again, he silences them. He answers in such a way that they didn't expect, and they didn't say anything else. So the next is the Sadducees. They show up and they ask about the resurrection. And again, once again, silences them. And then thirdly, a lawyer, one who's trained in the law, comes and asks him about the greatest commandment. And again, he silences them again. They're just utterly dumbfounded. Yeah. And it says they stop asking him questions after that.
Wow.
But then he asks them a question. He directly asks them a question about the identity of the Messiah from Psalm 110 and who is David's Lord. And they couldn't answer it. And so they were utterly embarrassed. They were challenged. Jesus declared his authority over them, and they've had enough. Yeah. So all that happened on Tuesday, but the day wasn't over yet, because on the way out of the temple complex, his disciples are noticing the grandeur of the temple. It was a beautiful, massive building.
Yeah.
And he says to them, well, soon not one stone from the temple will be left standing.
So you're saying it's going to be destroyed?
It's going to be destroyed. And they're like,
which is like it's the most important building.
It's the center of their religious worship. It's the center of their political strength. It's the center of their identity of the Jewish nation.
So that's explosive for him to say that.
Yeah, but they don't know what's going on. But they finish the journey out of Jerusalem. They cross the Kidron Valley up to the town of the Mount of Olives, where they could overlook the city of Jerusalem, see the whole Temple Mount, and they ask in private, "Hey, what did you mean when you said that about destroying the temple?
What are you trying to say there?
I mean, I know you just destroyed the temple leadership, basically.
Yeah.
But what do you mean the physical temple?"
Right.
And they said, when will these things take place, and what will be the sign of the end of the age? Because they just assume, look, if you're talking about destroying the temple, that's got to be the end of the age.
Right.
And he launches into his most lengthy teaching on the end times.
Okay.
In Matthew's version, there's 2 chapters worth of teaching. Yeah. And he describes 2 things. He describes both what's going to take place in a few decades, the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, and his return. which is the end of the close of the age. But he makes it clear that they're actually not the same thing, but one pictures the other.
Yeah.
And so that's the end of that teaching, and then
And that's the end of Tuesday?
that's the end of Tuesday.
Okay,
and they
so
retire for the day.
Wednesday's a quiet day, right?
Relatively speaking, but it's super important
Okay.
for setting up what's going to take place right after that.
Okay, what happens?
So Wednesday, the scriptures say that Jesus just goes back to the temple and keeps on teaching again, and the people are happily receiving his teaching.
Yeah.
But the religious leaders have had enough. They are done with this guy.
Okay.
He's overthrowing them. That's what he's doing. And so they devise this plot. They meet in Caiaphas's house, the high priest, in his private residence, and the Sanhedrin, or at least a contingent of the Sanhedrin, the ruling religious leaders. And they say, okay, how are we going to arrest and kill this guy? And they determine that we should wait 2 more days until after the feast of Passover. Till basically the idea is once everyone's done eating the Passover meal, then they'll disperse and leave Jerusalem, and they won't care as much, and the pilgrims will be leaving, and they can kind of do this more subtly without causing an uprising. Okay. So they're concerned about the people siding with Jesus.
Okay.
And what's interesting here, I think, is what we see throughout these days is this growing tension.
Right.
So Jesus, the Messiah, is coming into Jerusalem to establish his kingdom. And in order to establish his kingdom, he's got to overturn the current reigning authorities, culturally, politically, religiously. And so it's a clash of kingdoms. Jesus' kingdom, the true kingdom that's coming, the Messiah, God's kingdom, or this kingdom that has been holding Israel hostage, in a sense, God's people, by this false worship. And I did neglect to mention that he did pronounce, Jesus, before he left the temple, he pronounced 7 woes on the religious leaders and just utterly obliterated them.
Gasoline on the fire.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's what led to them wanting to plot to kill him. And so they're like, well, no, we got to take him out. Yeah. So either Jesus is going to establish his kingdom, or he's going to face death. That's the 2 options when you leave the day on Wednesday. What's ironic, in what Jesus always does, in God's mysterious plan, there's actually a third way.
Yeah.
He actually is going to face death, but that's not going to be the end of his kingdom. That's the means by which he establishes his kingdom. Yeah. It's through the payment of sin and eventually the resurrection on Sunday that Jesus' kingdom actually comes to pass.
So, okay, then help me with this. Monday through Wednesday happens. You get through Thursday. Friday, he dies. Sunday he rises, but then there's Saturday between it in Holy Week. So, when we get to Saturday in Holy Week, is there anything we're remembering? What happened during that week? What was going on?
The scriptures don't say a lot, especially compared to the other days. There's 2 brief things. One, it is the Sabbath day, so they are keeping the Sabbath.
Okay.
And the Sabbath is a time of rest, physically and spiritually. And no doubt the disciples, they are scarce, right? So Jesus' followers, so remember, they were up all night the night before, leading up to the crucifixion. So they're all sleep deprived. There's the leader, their Messiah that they've loved and was a friend that they also worshipped, had just been brutally killed, and they watched all this happen. They were powerless to stop it. And so they were just devastated, no doubt. They were probably somewhat in hiding. They could have easily slipped in among all the pilgrims that are in Jerusalem that day in kind of way. They're wondering if maybe they were going to be hunted down too. Yeah. Maybe they went back to Bethany and stayed in the same house they've been in all week. But what the scriptures do tell us that did take place on that day is the religious leaders, still so intent to secure their power and to make sure nothing would upend that now that they got this far, and that the people, again, still wouldn't rise up in protest, because maybe there were some weird things that happened, right? Like it got dark and the temple got torn and Jesus said some things from the cross. So maybe just want to make sure. And so they go to Pilate, who again is the Roman leader. The Jewish religious leaders go to the Roman civil leader, and they say, hey, this imposter, he predicted that he would rise again in 3 days. We want to make sure that doesn't happen, or we know it's not going to happen. We don't want anyone to claim that happened by stealing his body. So can you secure the temple with some guards? So he says, fine. So that's why there's guards that go and actually secure the temple. That happened on Saturday. Okay. But I think what's important about Saturday, just theologically, is that Jesus really did die. Yeah. He really was buried. Yeah. It wasn't like he didn't just kind of sort of die, or he didn't, swoon or faint or in a coma and then wake back up. He was buried.
Yeah.
He was dead. He was in the tomb. He was in the grave. And that symbolism of being in the grave and in death completely happened on Saturday. But we know theologically, Jesus' death, like ours, to be absent in the body, the person of the Lord, for us, and for Jesus, his body laid in the grave, but he wasn't, but his spirit was still alive. And so he was with the Father waiting for the resurrection.
Yeah. So, okay, we got these kind of quiet days in Holy Week compared to the others, of course. But when we're walking through this as Christians, we're walking through this week, we're thinking about Jesus's final week. I think one of the things that can happen to us is that, you see temples and tables and sacrifices and priests and all this. It can start to feel a little distant to life, what I'm doing right now. So help us. We see a lot. There's probably a lot you could say about how this changes and transforms life. But how would Monday through Wednesday, Saturday, how's that change the way someone's living their life this week as they're remembering Christ and remembering what he's done for us? What would be a few things that you would say is the way to think about this and the way it impacts me?
Well, I think a couple things that, this rising tension was all very purposeful. There's no accident here. From maybe even a merely human perspective, it's like, oh, Jesus is like, his death was just the result of some kind of unfortunate mixture of events, right? Like in a powder keg of cultural, religious, political things all exploded, and Jesus was the scapegoat. No, this was all very purposeful and planned, and Jesus did this intentionally to set up the redemption of his people. And so number one, Jesus was in control, and that was intentional, and it was necessary. But also, I think what Jesus was condemning among these religious leaders, it's still relevant for us today, and this is this religious hypocrisy, going through the forms of religion, and doing the outward things. They had the positions, they had the prestige of being those who worship God. And Jesus, in the 7 woes at the end of Tuesday, that was kind of the climax of this biting critique of this scathing rebuke, was that they were whitewashed tombstones. They were dead inside, but they looked good on the outside. And I think for so many people that might even, that don't even maybe usually come to church, but think about coming on Easter, the question is, does that look like them? Or why is the reason that this day you feel this need to, like, well, I better go to church? Because you feel a need to maybe just do the outward forms. And by all means, we want you to come. But don't think just because you're doing the outward forms of religion that now you're good. What Jesus really wants is a heart that's there ready to worship him, that believes in him, that believes he really is the Son of God, that believes that we really are sinners that need the Son of God to die for our sins. And that death was necessary to pay for our sins because we can't do it on our own. And so it's that hypocrisy that all of us are tempted by, because even those who are not once a year churchgoers, but they become every week, we could even think we're in a better position. Look, we always go to church. We do the sacrifices. We give money. We make sure we look nice on church on Sunday, and we even serve. But where is our heart? That's the problem that God sent Jesus to solve. It's hearts that were far from him, that they gave lip service. And so I think the word for us is to not be those people, to think that we can just go through the motions and Jesus will be happy with us.
That's really helpful. Yeah, as we're talking, I just think about everything we see in Holy Week. It says so many different things. One, it's striking that it's all just real. You walk through these days and you can kind of make them abstract, but when you walk through the details, this stuff happened. There was real events happening. Jesus was a real person. He was living, he was acting. But then another way to say this is, the second thing you see is it's real for us. When you talk about these things you see and applying to us, it's a really important week for us as believers and even people exploring Christianity to reflect on Christ's life, but then also reflect on how it impacts us. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to do that during Holy Week, and even for you to talk about these kind of uncommon days to see how they apply to us. So thank you and happy Easter.
Happy Easter to you.